Good morning, everyone. My name's Helen McIntosh, and I'm the president of the South East London Chamber of Commerce. We're absolutely delighted to have two of the partners of Thackray Williams, LLP solicitors. And our subject today is navigating your business lease. The first partner to present will be Yildiz Betez, and then followed by her partner, David Hacker. And we'll take questions at the end. So over to you, my fellow board director, Yildiz Betez. Over to you, Yildiz.
Thank you, Helen, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm assuming that most of you are here today because you're looking to negotiate a lease for new premises. So this morning I intend to talk through the main terms that need to be addressed and agreed from a tenant's perspective so that you're better informed when you go into the lease negotiations. This then avoids any time being lost by negotiations being reopened by your lawyer when it's clear that maybe you've not understood the consequences of what's been agreed in the heads of terms. When a landlord and tenant try to agree terms for a new business lease, each party will have clear objectives and aims. The landlord, of course, wants a clear income stream without any deductions and have the confidence that the property will be left in a good condition at the end of the lease. The tenant has freedom to run the business without interference and to control costs as much as possible and have some flexibility if their needs change. A well-negotiated lease will recognise both these different perspectives and try and find a balance between them. There's now a greater understanding that landlords and tenants need to work together and a lease negotiation should not be a battle. Normally, the landlord's agent or surveyor will advertise and negotiate terms on behalf of the landlord, but more often than not, the tenant negotiates on their own behalf without seeking any prior guidance or commercial advice from a surveyor or commercial property lawyer, and may not necessarily understand the implications of everything they agree to. It's important that you as the tenant have a clear business plan in terms of what you wish to achieve over the next 2 to 5 or 10 or more years with regards to your business. The terms negotiated should align themselves with your business strategy. So first of all, we're looking at premises and alterations. Now, the premises to be let must be clearly identified by description and by reference to a plan. The plan might need to be land registry compliant because a lease at 7 years or more is registrable at the land registry. If the premises are to be let as part of a larger building, then the definition needs to make it clear which, if any, of the structure is actually included in the letting. You also need to agree rights that you require, such as any parking rights. With regards to alterations, you might want to alter the property, perhaps reconfiguring the internal layout or adding new heating or air conditioning. The landlord will want to prevent any damage to other parts of the building and make sure the property is in a lettable condition at the end of the term. The usual compromise is to allow you to make non-structural alterations to the inside of the property as long as the landlord consents in advance. The landlord will usually agree to be reasonable in considering requests for consent. Structural alterations are normally prohibited. At the end of the lease, you will usually have to remove the alterations and hand back the premises in a good state of repair. This is an area ripe for dispute at the end of the term, and both parties normally need legal advice. David will expand on this further later on in the webinar. So who are the parties to the lease?
I'll put the most recent.
Sorry. The heads of terms must set out clearly the name of the landlord and tenant. And if they're companies, it's good practice to include the company number just to avoid confusion if there's a change of name. The landlord may ask for a guarantor and or a rent deposit, especially if the tenant is a newly formed company. But you as the director should avoid giving a personal guarantee and try to agree a reasonable rent deposit instead, which will be normally around 1 to 3 months worth. A rent deposit is normally released at the end of the term or on an assignment of the lease, but you can also negotiate an early release if you can show net profit to 3 times the rent. So how long should this lease be? Well, the length of the term of the lease will be a fine balance between what you require in terms of the business and the maximum income that can be guaranteed to the landlord. If flexibility to end the lease early is needed, you should agree a break clause. The break might be exercisable on a fixed date or on a rolling basis, and certain preconditions usually need to be satisfied, such as giving at least 6 months' notice. Advice should be taken on these conditions, as this is a frequent source of dispute. A tenant's lawyer will try and limit the other preconditions just to paying the basic annual rent and leaving the property free of occupants. The landlord may also wish to have a break clause, especially if it has plans for redevelopment. This may or may not work for you, depending on whether you have a long-term plan to stay in those premises. The main term that's misunderstood by tenants is the right to renew. An agreement will be reached about whether you will have the benefit of the right to renew at the end of the term, as provided by the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954, or whether the lease should be contracted out of the provision so it comes to an automatic end when the contractual term expires. It's important to note that the 1954 Act does not guarantee the renewal of the lease. It just provides you the right to request a new lease on similar terms to the current lease, apart from the rent, which if not agreed are determined by the court. But the landlord does have 7 statutory grounds on which to oppose renewal, such as redevelopment. And in those circumstances, you'll be entitled to compensation at the rateable value or twice the rateable value if the business has been there for more than 14 years. David will go into this in more detail about the tenant's rights under the 1954 Act. But just simply, if you're a tenant and you're looking to be in those premises for the long term as you build up your business, you should simply insist on the right to renew if you can. The next thing to consider is the permitted use and planning consent. The landlord will want to control the types of activities carried on at the premises, and you need to be sure that the premises can be used for the purpose of the business. So the lease will set out the use that's allowed by the landlord. This can be very specific or may be referred to just one of the use classes as set by planning law. Landlords will be wary of making the use too restrictive, as this could reduce the potential rent on rent review. And you don't want it to be too restrictive either, as you might want to assign a lease. So you need to know that you'll be able to sign the lease without having to apply for a change of use from the landlord. But most importantly, you need to check early on if there's actually planning consent for the permitted use. Otherwise, the landlord or you will need to apply for a change of use, which can take at least 8 weeks or more without any guarantee of planning consent being issued. If the landlord is prepared to allow an application to be made and you wish to wait to see that if planning consent can be obtained, then it's likely that an agreement for lease conditional on planning will be exchanged, subject to an agreed long stop date, if after which planning consent is not issued, then either party can walk away from the deal. But I always advise tenants at the very, very beginning to speak to the council to check if there is planning consent for what they want to do, because they might just decide to walk away from the premises at that point if they don't want to wait to apply for planning consent. So in regards to repair, service charge and insurance, both the landlord and tenant will want the property to be well maintained, and both will have some obligation to repair, especially if it's a lettered part of a building. The extent of the obligation will vary depending on the type of property and exactly what is let to you. A business lease of a floor or a unit in a large building will usually exclude structural parts, and the landlord will be responsible for maintaining these, as well as the shared areas and access routes. You'll be required to keep the property included in the lease in a good and substantial repair and condition, except where damage is covered by insurance. This means that if the property is not in a good state of repair at the start of the lease, then you may have to bring it up to that state of repair and maintain it. If the property is in a poor condition when the lease is granted, you should negotiate that your repairing obligation be limited to keeping it in no better state and condition as at the date of the lease, as evidenced by schedule of condition. And this will normally be a photographic schedule and should be attached to the lease as evidence. When the whole of a building is let to one tenant, the tenant usually needs to maintain all of it, including the roof and foundations. It's more complex in a multi-let building where leases will often only include the internal parts, and the structure and the common areas will be retained by the landlord, who will be obliged to repair them. The landlord will be able to recover the cost as a service charge. We normally advise tenants to cap the service charge so that there is certainty with regards to their outgoings. The cap, if agreed, is normally increases annually in accordance with the retail price index or consumers price index. The lease should clearly set out what can be included in the service charge, as well as items that must never be included, such as upgrades to the property that go beyond what is required to repair it. There should be a right to challenge the service charge items and inspect quotes and receipts. The landlord will also be required to insure the property and can recover the cost of the premium from the tenant, and this is in addition to the service charge. As long as the tenant does nothing to invalidate the insurance, the landlord will be responsible for repairing any damage covered by the insured risk using the insurance proceeds. And the lease will normally give the tenant a period of free rent if damage is so severe that property cannot be used. Either party may have the right to end the lease if the property hasn't been fully repaired within an agreed time. When we went into lockdown to stop the spread of COVID, it came as a shock to many tenants to learn that they still had to pay the rent, even though it was illegal for them to trade from the premises. As a result, many tenants now want leases to provide for some sort of rent holiday. So if the business is forced to close under government instructions due to a future pandemic or some other reason beyond the landlord and tenant's control. This is still relatively new, so the terms actually offered by the landlord depends on how keen they are to let a particular property and how much they value you as a potential tenant. The next thing you need to agree is the rent review and any rent-free periods. Another key part of the lease negotiations will be the yearly rent. The yearly rate is normally paid quarterly on the usual quarter days, but you may wish to try and agree that the rent is paid monthly in order to assist with cash flow. The landlord may permit this as a personal concession to you, but no further. The tenant may also be able to negotiate a rent-free period at the start of the lease, which is usually intended to reflect the cost of fitting out the premises for the purpose of the business. The rent-free period could give an invaluable bit of breathing space to get established in the new business, in the new premises. In the current market, landlords are keen to secure good tenants, so it's well worth pushing for the longest rent-free period that you can get. If the lease is longer than 5 years, then there'll usually be provision for rent to be reviewed upwards only, typically at 5-year intervals. The new rent may be settled by reference to the open market at the relevant time, or it may be index linked. The purpose of the rent review is to ensure that the landlord's investment value keeps pace with the market during the life of the lease. However, it's a surveyor, not a lawyer, that can only advise a tenant on the level of rent and rent reviews. With regards to assignments and underlettings, as with all aspects of the business, you'll want as much flexibility as possible if you no longer want or need to occupy the premises. Most leases allow the tenant to transfer the lease to a third party or to sublet, but only with the landlord's consent. By law, the landlord must act reasonably, but they're allowed to impose conditions setting out why they may refuse consent. A tenant's lawyer will try to limit these to the tenant being up to date with rent and the new tenant being financially strong enough to take on the lease obligations. In some cases, the tenant may need to enter into a statutory agreement guarantee so that if a new tenant does not meet the lease obligations or pay the rent, then the outgoing tenant will need to do so. This is what's called an authorised guarantee agreement, or an AGA for short. If the outgoing tenant was also guaranteed on the lease, then the outgoing guarantor may also need to guarantee the AGA. And this is another good reason why you as a director shouldn't really give a personal guarantee for your company. If the property lends itself to it, then you should ensure that you can underlet part as well as the whole. For example, if you occupy more than one floor and wish to be able to sublet one of the floors. You should also consider whether you wish to request the ability to share occupation with a third party, and this is normally allowed between group companies. So finally, legal costs. Each party should really bear their own legal costs, but if a particular property is highly sought after and there are lots of applicants, then the landlord may try to ask for a contribution towards their legal fees. And if they do, then you should try and fix and cap those costs. And I just wanted to mention the leasing code. Now, this code has been around for over 25 years, but it's not really had any impact because it didn't have any penalties for not complying with the code. However, a new version of the code was launched in September 2020, and the purpose is to improve the quality and the fairness of the lease negotiations. And it's only mandatory for RICS registered surveyors. So if the landlord is not RICS registered, then they don't need to comply with the lease code. But one of the things the lease code does is set out what is best practice. So, for example, prospective tenants should be told at the outset whether the lease is to be contracted out of the Landlord Tenant Act 1954, and actually should be advised to get professional advice with regards to this issue. And also, the code says that an AGA should only be required if reasonable rather than it being obligatory. And the reinstatement of tenants' alterations should only be required if reasonable. So that's just examples of some of the best practice it lays down. So once the heads of terms are agreed, they need to be made subject to survey and contract. And this is because that is only once the terms are agreed, you'll have a survey done and the legal process will be started. And something may come up during that period that will require you to go back and renegotiate the heads of terms. So a good example is where you're taking on a lease of a whole building and you undertake the survey and you find that, say, the roof needs repairs. You're going to need to go back to the landlord to either agree that the landlord does the repairs before the lease is completed, or you take on the repairs but maybe agree a reduced rent and or a longer rent-free period, as well as possibly a scheduler condition. So that's really all I need to say on heads of terms. And I'm going to pass you over to David, who's now going to talk you through what happens when the lease comes up for renewal. Thank you.
Thanks, Yildiz, for that. That was really useful, informative talk. So the question is, what is it I do that's different from Yildiz? Because Yildiz and I, our teams, we sort of work closely together. But what I deal with and Yildiz has sort of mentioned this in passing, I deal with the sometimes necessary statutory notices that are required under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954. As you'll be aware, business leases generally attract statutory protection under that act. What that means is that when your lease comes to an end, so the lease that Yildiz has put in place for you comes to an end, the tenancy that's been created under that lease will continue until it is brought to an end by either the landlord serving what is called a Section 25 notice or a tenant serving a Section 26 notice. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Now, some leases are excluded from this statutory protection, and those leases and the tenancies that are created by them do come to an end when the lease ends. And in those circumstances, the tenant doesn't have any right to remain in the premises once that lease has come to an end. In those situations, really, if the tenant wants to stay, it does give the landlord an opportunity to effectively dictate terms to the tenant on a take it or leave it basis, depending on the market. So tenancies that don't have statutory protection from a tenant's perspective are not as attractive. For my talk today, though, I'm going to concentrate on protected leases and assume that you do have a protected lease. I should say it's not uncommon for tenants to continue to hold over on their excluded lease, on their old lease for many months, if not years, after the lease itself has expired. For some tenants, they quite like that flexibility if they're not sure what their plans are. However, for other tenants and for landlords, they want the security of knowing that they have a lease in place for a specified number of years. So I'll be proceeding on the basis that you're a tenant, that your lease is either coming to an end or has come to an end, and that you want the security of knowing that you've got a new lease in place. So what should you do? Well, in the first instance, you might want to talk to your landlord or their agent and see whether there are any terms on offer for a new lease, and see if it can be agreed without the necessity of going through a full statutory renewal process. Obviously, I only really deal with the ones that do go through that process, but I'm sure that is just a small percentage of the ones that don't need it. If your landlord doesn't respond, or they do, but the terms are ones that you don't consider are reasonable, because, for example, the rent they want is too high, then you might then want to proceed with your statutory renewal options. It would always be my suggestion that you should take professional advice from a commercial agent, first of all, in relation to what sort of terms might be reasonable, taking into account that in a statutory lease renewal process, your starting point for the new lease is that you are entitled to the new lease on the same terms as the existing one. You might want to take particular advice on what the market rent might be and what the likely length of the new lease might be. Again, your starting point for that will probably be the length of your current lease. I think Yildiz and I have perhaps seen over the last couple of years that tenants seem to like taking slightly shorter leases, particularly coming out the back of COVID, where they want that flexibility of being able to leave the premises when they want to, rather than having a long lease that they might have to go through that assignment process that Yildiz was talking about. Because even with a shorter lease, if it's got statutory protection, the tenant's always got the right to renew that lease. So let's assume that your informal negotiations with the landlord have not been successful, and you decide to start the formal lease renewal process, or possibly your landlord has. I should just stress at this point that if you as the tenant, if you are wanting to start the statutory renewal process, you must have a written lease in place. I do come across quite often tenants who come to me and there's never actually been a lease might have been talked about, there might have been something drafted, but it was never actually completed. These statutory notices I'm just about to talk about can only be served where there is a written lease in place. So, you're a tenant and you want to serve the Section 26 notice. So what does that notice look like? There is a precept form that needs to be completed, and this needs to be sent to what is called your competent landlord. Now, I don't want to get overly technical at this point, but your competent landlord may not be the landlord that you're currently paying rent to. This might apply in a situation where your landlord is a tenant themselves and their lease is soon to expire. In those circumstances, your competent landlord to whom you send your Section 26 notice might be your landlord's landlord. Assuming, however, that your landlord to whom you're paying rent is your competent landlord, then you complete the Section 26 notice by inserting relevant details into it, including the terms you propose for the new lease. You then send it to your competent landlord. The Section 26 notice must terminate your current tenancy at least 6 months, but no more than 12 months after it's given. I should also stress, it probably goes without saying, that you cannot bring your lease to an end on a date earlier than the actual lease expiry date. So with these notices, it's crucial that they are sent to the landlord correctly. What I always suggest is that they are either hand-delivered or preferably hand-delivered, sent by first class and recorded or special delivery. And that way you can ensure that your competent landlord receives the notice. Once the landlord's got it, then they have to indicate within 2 months whether they intend to oppose you being granted a new lease at all. If they do, then they have to send you a counter notice specifying the statutory grounds upon which they are opposing renewal. Now, Yildiz mentioned that there are 7 statutory grounds in her talk. And the main 2 that really landlords tend to rely on in opposing lease renewals are that they either want to redevelop the premises or they want to occupy for their own purposes, be that for commercial or residential purposes. In those circumstances, they've served the counter notice within the 2 months that they need to, and they can prove their grounds that are genuine, then the landlord will be entitled to oppose the renewal and get possession of the property. That may be at the end of the date in Section 26 notice. It may be later if this is challenged in court. But ultimately, if they can prove their grounds, then they get possession, but you are entitled, as Yildiz mentioned, to statutory compensation. Okay, so going on, I'm going to assume that your landlord is not opposed to you having a new lease, but does not necessarily agree to the terms that you propose, which, in my experience with the notices that I deal with, that's common. There's usually some gap between what the landlord's looking for and what the tenant's looking for. In those circumstances, it is absolutely imperative that an application to the court is made before the date that the Section 26 expires, or you enter into an agreement with the landlord in writing to extend that date. If you don't have a new lease in place by the expiry of the Section 26 notice, then your tenancy comes to an end, and you'd have to, well, you'd either have to leave the premises, or the landlord can effectively again dictate terms for a new tenancy. So if there's one takeaway from my talk today for you, is when you serve these notices, or if you receive a Section 25 notice, make sure you diarise, double diarise, triple diarise the date that's in those notices, because you have to take action before that notice expires. Some landlords might just receive the notice, sit on their hands and do nothing, and see whether you take those steps to renew your lease. And if you don't, then you lose your rights, and the landlord's potentially in a very strong position. Once your Section 26 has been served, again, I generally advise that you pass the matter back to your professional advisors, or possibly over to Yildiz, to try and agree the terms of the new lease. Generally, my involvement is quite limited to drafting and serving those original notices, and then I have very little to do until the notice actually expires, and then I might need to deal with either trying to extend the date or issuing an application at the county court for you to protect your statutory rights. As I say, one of three things has got to happen. You've got to have either a new lease in place by the end of the notice period, or a court application has to be issued, or you have to have extended the date in that notice. So what if there are disagreements about terms? Remember this, Yildiz was sort of dealing with your first lease. I'm coming into it now. This is the end of your first lease, you're looking to renew. Generally, there's going to be some negotiation regarding the terms, particularly around the rent that's going to be paid, and possibly the length of the lease. As I say, your landlord may want a longer lease, you may want a shorter, more flexible one. Landlords may want a break clause inserted in the new lease, and you may want to resist that. All of these matters are open to negotiation, and ultimately, if they can't be determined, then by the court has the ultimate power to determine the terms of the new lease. I should also add at this point that you're only entitled to a new lease of the premises that you occupy for business purposes. So what do I mean by that? Well, for example, if you're renting a shop with a flat above, and you rent the flat out on an assured short-hold tenancy basis, then when you come to renew your lease, you may only be entitled to claim a new business lease of the ground floor premises where you run your business from. However, your landlord can insist on you taking a new lease of all the premises that were in the previous lease, including the flat. Ultimately, it's a matter of election for the landlord. As regards the other terms of the lease, as I said at the outset, starting point for the new lease will be the terms of the old one. Court has the ultimate power to determine what the terms will be, and in the event of a dispute over the terms, then it may have to go before a judge at the county court to see whether there should be a departure from the old lease terms, and if so, how far they should depart. Other things to be aware of. You may or probably will have to pay interim rent from the date of expiry of the Section 26 notice. What's interim rent? Well, because often there's a long gap between the end of the Section 26 notice and the date on which the new renewed lease comes into force, then for that interim period, you have to pay an interim rent. Generally, interim rent is payable at the same rate as the rent under the new lease. Although this is not set in stone, but that is the general rule. So you could find yourself, as well as having to pay a higher rent under your new lease, having to pay a backdated interim rent liability since the Section 26 notice expired, if it takes a while for the new lease to be finally agreed or determined. So you may, again, take professional advice on what that might be, because you might need to put some money aside each month to pay that. If ultimately and hopefully you are able to agree the fresh terms with landlord, then everything will be covered by way of the new lease, and Yildiz will, or another commercial property solicitor will actually put that together for you. If terms are not agreed and the case goes to court, then the new lease commences 3 months after the court makes a decision on what the terms of the new lease should be. I should stress it's highly unusual for cases to go to court and be determined by the judge. I've been dealing with commercial lease renewals for about 30 years, and in that time I've had a tiny handful of cases go to court, probably less than 5. And generally, then it's an issue over rent rather than other terms. In taking you through this sort of lease renewal process this morning, I've somewhat simplified it because it is very, very technical. And the best advice I'd give you is, if you want to serve one of these notices or you receive one of them, then take specialist advice on it. Because I've seen too many times tenants come to me with a notice, a Section 25 or a Section 26 notice that's just expired, and there isn't really much that I can do for them. As I say, the rules under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954 are complex, and there are pitfalls, particularly in relation to these dates. I've also said in my accompanying slide that your landlord might, if you had to give a guarantee or rent deposit under the old lease, that they might on a renewal, they might want you to renew that guarantee or that deposit. This might be an area where there's a dispute, particularly if you've been a model tenant for a number of years, always paying your rent on time. And the strength of your business has increased, but the landlord says on the renewal they still want a guarantee, and you perhaps say, rightly, well, why do you? Again, ultimately, it can't be agreed. The court have the power to determine whether there is a guarantee or not. Remember also, when renewing your lease, that there will be obligations under the old lease as regards repairs. The extent of repairs will differ and will be according to what the old lease actually says. Again, you need to take professional advice on that. A landlord will probably require any renewal of the lease to carry forward any repair obligations under your old lease. And it may only really be towards the end of the lease that whether it's renewed or not, that your landlord takes an active interest in the state of repair and may want to inspect with their surveyor, what's been going on. Again, always my advice: take professional advice from the surveyor on what the repairing obligations are. It might be possible under the new lease on a renewal to agree a schedule of condition to limit the obligations on you. Okay, so I've covered a lot of material. whilst most lease renewals take place amicably, it's always useful, if not essential, to have your suite of professional advisors on hand to guide you through the process. And that's really me done. So Yildiz and I are happy to take questions on any of this. So yeah, shall I hand you back to Helen?
Thank you very much, David and Yildiz. Lovely. So we've got all the details there, and just so everyone knows, we'll be circulating the webinar later, and also, you know, so you'll see the 4 different places in London. We know you're in Bromley, David.
Yeah, probably obvious.
And there's quite a bit of activity, hasn't there, with sirens where you are?
Oh, yeah.
That's it. So can we take the slides down, Charlie, please? And then we'll take any questions. Right, can people put their little yellow hand up if you've got a question? Everyone's mute. Am I? Oh, James, real hand.
real hand.
Real hand. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Thank you, David. Thank you, audience. So the question I have is regarding lease renewals. Are there any sources of information you can go to very quickly establish whether a renewal offer is unfair or unjust?
Not particularly. I'm aware. I mean, as I say, your starting point is what's your existing lease.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how does, you know, how might they differ? If there is a big difference, then apart from in relation to rent, because obviously rent's likely to, you know, rent will have changed.
Yep.
If it's a big difference, then there might that might give you an indication. Well, maybe some of this is not entirely reasonable. I mean, you need, because these things are so sort of specific. You really always need to take advice. Really, I don't think there's any sort of, you know, generic other than say that, you know, look at your existing lease.
Yeah, can I just say, I mean, the whole point of the legal process is to allow both the landlord and tenant to instruct surveyors to negotiate before that notice expires. So really quite early on, you probably need to engage a commercial surveyor to start talking to the landlord. If, you know, if those terms are not agreeable to you and you want to negotiate better terms, just to see if an agreement can be reached before that notice expires and you need to take any kind of action to protect your rights.
Okay, and how many months ahead of the lease renewal would you guys start on the renegotiation?
Okay, well, I mean, I normally say to clients, you need to start looking at your lease 18 months before it expires.
Okay.
You know, and you need to know what you're planning to do. I mean, a lot of them tenants don't really know, but, you know, you should probably diarise to look at the position at 18 months and see what strategy is going to be going forward. And maybe start talking to your landlord if you wanted to renew the lease.
Yeah,
okay. Great.
I mentioned in my, you know, sometimes tenants are very happy to just let things sort of roll on without formal renewal taking place. Particularly if you want that flexibility, it's very, if you're not sure, or do I want to be here for another 5 years, 10 years? If you're not sure about that, then you as long as you've got a protected lease, you can just sort of let it roll on, unless the landlord might start the process. It doesn't really matter. I just also say it doesn't really matter whether the landlord or the tenant starts the process. There isn't any particular sort of tactical advantage one way or another. But yeah,
Okay.
it's down to you.
Great, thank you.
Excellent. Do we have any more questions? Oh, Jesse?
This question before we go on in. Presently, my shop is on the high street, and the high street is really down as we see. My
Jesse,
Sorry.
you're not very clear, and I know you're on your iPhone.
Yeah.
Would it be?
I only pick up 1 in 3 words, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Sorry, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, can now.
All right. So what I was saying is, the landlord wants to increase the price of the lease from 1,250 to 1,500, and my lease expired last year May, and I've not accepted a new lease because I said to him, "You've not justified the increase. Why you want such jump from 125 to 15?" So running mad now, and also trying to prove to the landlord that the business is also suffering due to the drop on the high street. I'm like a month behind in rent. What dangers would I be facing as a result to this?
If you haven't paid your rent, you have a big danger, because your landlord could. You've got a written lease. I'm assuming you've got a written lease in place. Your landlord could potentially forfeit your lease and lock you out, potentially. So, I mean, my standing advice to all commercial tenants is never ever withhold rent, because unlike with residential properties, commercial landlords can just go in, forfeit the lease, and change the locks. So if there's a dispute about rent, you need to deal with it another way. But don't withhold rent.
I have spoke to an independent lease reviewer who said the increase cannot be justified, and he can pick up the case to make them don't pay present price for the next 2 years. But the issue there now is what spending money that or just wait to be.
Jesse, you keep cutting out. So you keep cutting out.
Jesse, why don't you give me a call separately?
Yeah.
Give me a call. My number's on the slides, and give me a call and I'll chat with you on the phone.
Jesse, we'll ask Charlie after this. He'll send you David's details, okay? That would be good. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Penny, you have a pretty hand.
Yeah.
There we go.
So basically, if we've got a lease that's coming to an end on a commercial premises and we are happy with the tenant and we're going to reoffer the lease, can we do just an annex, because all that's changing is the maturity date of the lease and the rent, or do we have to do a whole new lease?
Okay, so basically, if you've agreed terms, then what we can do is you still need a new lease. You can't just do an annex, because I think you could probably do that with short-hold tenancies, but not with commercial. Okay. So what you would do, you need a lease renewal, and normally, if not a lot is going to change, it doesn't really need any modernisation, then we would do a renewal by reference to the existing lease and just say what terms have changed. But it will still need to be a lease. And also, if the lease is for more than 7 years, it'll probably need to be registered and stamp duty may be payable. So it still needs to be done formally as a lease.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Do we have any more questions? Sean. Hello, Sean.
Hi, Rory. Just to understand, what is the difference between a license to occupy over a lease? If a tenant is requesting a license to occupy going forward from expiry of a lease.
Okay, and why are they requesting that? Is that something that's happening right now?
It's the lease is expiring in 11 months' time. Okay. I think they perceive it as an option for flexibility.
Yeah. Well, it's not, because if you're giving so again, this is where it gets a little bit technical. But a license to occupy you normally use if you're not actually giving someone exclusive possession, and it's for a short period of time. But you know, the danger of a license to occupy, even if you call it a license to occupy, it may actually track the statutory rights and protection, because if they're paying rent and they've got exclusive possession, then actually they're going to have a business tenancy. So I would advise landlords against the license to occupy unless it really is a genuine situation in which we can grant a license to occupy. But it sounds like this would have to be a lease renewal. It'd have to be a lease that needs to be in place.
You take some advice from you guys before you get a little bit further. As I say, it's 11 months to the expiry, so maybe it's
so absolutely. Again, you can drop me a line, give me a copy of what the lease is at the moment, and tell me what you're proposing to agree, and then I can just tell you what the next steps are.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for that.
Okay.
Okay, and Sean, again, if you want, Charlie to say, because this is interesting, because this is one former board director speaking to a current board director of the South East London Chamber of Commerce.
Oh, good.
There we go. Do we have any more questions? Oh, Jennifer.
Hi, everyone. I've got a question, but also a situation. And I'm not sure where we stand. We took over a hotel in Blackpool last year, April. And from day one, we took it over from a previous tenant. From day one, we had a situation with the landlord. Initially, we weren't able to get the booking.com platform. Took over 4 or 5 months. Then we finally got that. Now, in the last few months, we've been kind of locked out. And I just want to know where we stand, because we got legal advice. We got the solicitor involved, but nowhere in the paperwork did it show that after 21 days of owing her, he had the right to come in and lock us out. But the thing was, when she initially tried to lock us out, we did not owe her anything. She got a bogus company. And when we contacted them and sent them the paperwork, they pulled back. He then did it again with this other company. And when we spoke to them, they didn't do an itinerary. So all our stuff is still at the hotel, our private, because we had a flat there. So all our private stuff is still locked in there, or I don't know if she's got rid of it. And they pulled out when they realized that she had again done wrong. And I just don't know. I don't know where to go with this, because we've tried a few different ways, and it's just, we're now nearly 6 months in of not being able to run our business or get our stuff. She doesn't reply to nothing. So yeah, we're a bit stuck at the moment.
Yeah, this is probably a question for me, Jennifer. I mean, you need to make an application to the, I think it sounds like she tried to, they forfeit the lease. I'm not quite sure whether they've done it properly or not. But you need to make an application to the court for probably, well, either a declaration that they've unlawfully forfeit your lease, and/or an application for what's called relief from forfeiture to get the lease back. I mean, generally, they can only sort of go in after 21 days if the lease allows them to, and if there's money outstanding. Rent or possibly service charge, or perhaps insurance rent. So that's a bit odd, but ultimately, if you want to get back in, landlord's not engaging with you. You have to go to the county court and issue an application.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you need to take. You'll need to. You said you had solicitors. You definitely need to take specialist advice on that. Not straightforward, unfortunately.
Okay. And is that something you guys do, or is there?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do. Absolutely, I deal with forfeiture. So again, I mean, happy to.
Yes, and again, Jennifer, we'll ask Charlie to send you David's details, okay?
Thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
Okay, excellent. Joseph, I think you're going to be our last. Oh no, got time. Yeah.
Okay,
Joseph,
I'll just hi there. Hello, I'll just be quick. I have a commercial lease, and the landlord has chosen to charge VAT on that lease, and I just wondered what the implications are there, or whether this is something that has to be paid, but they've chosen to tax it, put VAT on the rent and the service charges. So it's just like, because I haven't had a lease like that before.
Yeah. So have you only how long have you had this lease, Joseph?
Since 2021. Was it 21?
Okay, so they charge VAT at the beginning?
They did, yes, and the renewal is coming up in November, I think. Yeah.
Because what your lawyer at the time should have explained is, with commercial property, basically it's VAT exempt unless the landlord makes an election to opt for VAT. So it sounds like they've made an option to tax, which then means they can charge VAT on the rent.
Okay.
And that's the information they should have given you at the outset before you went into the lease, as to whether that option had been made. And even if they hadn't made that option, they can make that option at any time. Any landlord on a commercial property can actually opt to tax at any time, and the VAT becomes payable, and then you're going to have to look to your accountant as to how you can recover that VAT.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
It's part of the lease, sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have any more? We can take one final question.
It's a really weird thing that they can choose or not choose.
Oh, well, is that Joseph again? Okay. Well, do we have any more questions? No. Well, I found this so interesting this morning, and thank you, Yildiz and David. It's been really good.
Well,
if anyone ever wants to get in touch, then please do, because it's technical stuff.
Super. We'll certainly do that, Charlie. I will ask Charlie to do this after the event. I'm going to give one very small plug for the chamber. If anyone would like to go to Alcatel Submarine Networks for a breakfast meeting next Wednesday, the 28th of February, 7:30 to 9:30 in East Greenwich, please book in. If you haven't been there, Alcatel make the repeaters for the internet. There you go. Because the useless factoid for the day is that 100% of the no internet connections, well, they make the fast fiber, sorry, not for the internet. No internet connections actually go via the clouds. Everything is underground, 100%. There you go.
Okay.
Absolutely fascinating manufacturing plant. And if you come to the breakfast, that they'll, talk about Alcatel Submarine Networks and what they do. So that's next Wednesday, and you can book online. And when you get the details later, Charlie, we've got more webinars coming up, and full details will be there. So again, I'd just like to say, second time, Yildiz and David, thank you so much. It's been so informative.
And thanks for
See you again soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye. Bye.